He tried to destroy my career at Google. He manipulated meetings, spread veiled rumors, and played dirty to erase me. 3 years later, I received a notification on LinkedIn. It was him. The message began with, "Hi, how are you?" As if nothing had happened. But I remembered everything. I remembered the look on his face when he saw me being reprimanded for something he caused. I remembered the look on his face when I tried to defend myself. I remembered the silence. And now he was here, asking me for a chance. Life takes turns, and in Silicon Valley, those turns are quick and cruel. Here, the game of status, influence, and reputation changes as quickly as technology. And I had turned the page, rebuilt everything from scratch. But before I tell you how I responded, you need to understand how this war began. Because this is not just a story of corporate betrayal. It is a story about how to resist when everyone wants you to give up. And most importantly, how to win without having to bring anyone down. Google is marketed to the world as one of the most incredible places to work. Colorful chairs, free cafeterias, rest areas with beanbags, games, and even meditation rooms. But behind this aesthetic of innovation and lightness, there is a silent jungle. And in it, survival does not depend only on competence. It depends on perception. It depends on who defends you in a room where you are not even present. It depends on what people whisper when your name appears in an email. Google, and other technology giants like Amazon, Meta, and Apple, carry this aura of genius and collaboration. But the reality for many inside is very different. High performance is not a differentiator. It is the minimum requirement. Everyone there is brilliant. Everyone there was the best somewhere. The environment then naturally becomes a field of constant comparison. And this type of culture, when not well managed, turns into a silent competition for credit, for merits, for the spotlight. The funny thing is that almost no one admits this war. It happens in the details. Who was mentioned first in a report? Who presented the final result in a meeting? Who appears in the email sent to the global team? And this directly affects people's egos. Because Silicon Valley is not just about technology, it's about status. About who will be the next name behind a digital revolution. Who will be promoted to the next executive role? Who will be called to lead a new team, a new idea, a new startup? This scarcity mentality disguised as abundance creates tensions, conflicts that no one verbalizes, but everyone feels. And it was in this environment that everything happened. In the midst of a culture that, while filling you with resources to innovate, also demands unquestionable performance from you, while throwing you into a game where ethics does not always win. And it's important to say, I didn't go into this innocently. I knew Google was a demanding company. I knew it would be challenging. What I didn't know was how much internal conflicts, often disguised as feedback or strategic decisions, could undermine entire careers without a single word being said. The culture of silence is real. There are no explicit scandals. There are subtle exclusions, project changes without explanation, invitations that stop coming, agendas that are never shared, and before you know it, you're already being left out, but without being able to prove anything. Because everything is calculated. Everything is done under the appearance of normality. That's the cruelest part. High performance doesn't destroy you directly. It silences you until you doubt yourself. And it was in this scenario that my colleague, the one who years later would ask me for a job, started to move. He was charismatic, discreet. He knew how to play with words well. And above all, he knew where and when to plant doubts about someone without seeming aggressive. It started slowly. Small comments about the progress of my projects, subtle questions in meetings, smiles that hid intentions. At first, I thought it was all in my head. After all, we were all under pressure. But the frequency and strategy behind his actions made it clear. This was sabotage. And what shocked me the most was realizing that no one saw it. Or worse, those who did see it pretended not to see it. Because if you point the finger in Silicon Valley, you can end up being seen as the problem. The invisible rule is clear. Defend yourself without seeming defensive. Prove without accusing. React without confronting. And this requires a balance that is almost impossible to maintain, especially when all you want to do is scream that you are being wronged. It was in this context that I began to understand the true meaning of high-performance culture. It's not about competing with others. It's about surviving the system. A system where those who play dirty are often seen as strategic, where the line between collaboration and opportunism is thin, where silence is more valued than confrontation, and where, ironically, Those who talk the most about empathy are those who practice it the least. And perhaps this is the biggest trap. You enter thinking you're in an environment of collective innovation, but you discover that you're in an arena of reputations, where someone's next step could be their last within the company. It was in this environment that my personal war began. But it was also there that I realized that the only way out was not to confront. It was to evolve in such a solid way that, at some point, he would have to see me on the other side of the table. Joining Google was a turning point in my life, not only because of the prestige the company carries, but because it symbolized a profound change in my professional career. For years, I had prepared for that moment. I studied, graduated, worked at smaller companies, faced exhausting interviews, refined my portfolio, and polished every line of my resume to get there. When I received the approval email, I was paralyzed. It was as if all the effort had finally paid off. Only those who have dedicated themselves for years to a goal understand the emotional weight of achieving it. Joining Google was not just starting a new job, it was proving, to myself and to the world, that I was capable of being among the best. During the first few days, everything seemed magical. Every meeting, every person, every detail of the office reflected a universe where knowledge was taken seriously, and innovation seemed palpable on every floor. I was excited, thirsty to learn, eager to contribute. I felt like I had found my place. But there's one thing no one tells you about reaching the top. When you get there, the game changes. The competition doesn't diminish. It intensifies. At the bottom, you compete for opportunity. At the top, you compete for relevance. And in the first few months, I began to realize how complex the relationships there were. There were smiles, yes. There was cordiality, yes. But there was also an invisible tension hanging over every conversation. There was a weight to the words, an excessive care with what was said, as if everyone was constantly trying to protect their own reputation. The environment was friendly on the surface, but there was something behind every compliment that I couldn't ignore. It was as if every gesture was calculated, as if, behind the apparent collaboration, there was a game of influence going on all the time. Little by little, I began to understand that it wasn't enough to deliver good results. It was necessary to build silent alliances, to gain the trust of those who really made decisions. And above all, to learn to position yourself strategically, even when that wasn't your profile. My job was technical, but the evaluations went far beyond the deliverables. Everything was subjective. Performance was also measured by how you presented yourself, how you behaved in meetings, who mentioned you positively, and even more so, who remained silent. In practice, this meant that perception counted as much as competence. And that was exactly when things started to go wrong. Because I was never the type of person who knew how to play the political game. I always believed that doing a good job would be enough. But in environments like Google, this belief is dangerous. I soon realized that, while I was dedicated to delivering impeccable results, others were focused on ensuring that their names were heard more than mine. And it was in this scenario that he appeared, the colleague who would become the trigger for the worst phase of my career. At first, he seemed friendly. He asked questions about my projects, complimented my solutions, offered to help. But there was something strange about the way he approached me. It was as if he was always trying to get something out of me, watching me, measuring me, testing my limits. I thought it was just an impression and decided to stay focused on my work. The problem is that, in this kind of environment, any loophole becomes a weapon. And he began to exploit each one with a coldness that, at the time, I was unable to perceive. It started with small distortions in meetings. He would add to my statements in a way that diminished my contribution. When I presented an idea, he would wait a few seconds and rephrase it in different words. And magically, the room would respond to his version, not mine. It was subtle, but constant. And I began to doubt myself. Was I overreacting? Was my communication poor? Was he right? That's when something more serious happened. In an important meeting, where we were going to present an impact report on a project I had been leading for weeks, he took the lead without telling me anything. He spoke as if he had led the entire process, using my data, my analyses, my recommendations, and when I tried to intervene, he interrupted me with a, "Yes, that's what she meant," as if he were supporting me. But in practice, he was erasing me. When the meeting ended, I was overcome by a strange feeling, a mixture of frustration and helplessness. I knew what had happened, but I had no way of proving it. And the worst part, no one spoke up. The people around me pretended not to notice. Or worse, they noticed and thought it was normal. That had a profound impact on me. It was the first time I felt that my career was being put at risk by someone on the inside, not because of my incompetence, but because of someone else's strategic manipulation. From that day on, everything started to change. My confidence began to erode. I started to become silent in meetings. I stopped proposing ideas with enthusiasm. I felt like I was being watched, judged, tested with every word. The brilliance I had at the beginning was replaced by constant tension. And even with good deliveries, the perception around me seemed to cool. I found myself excluded from decisions that used to be my responsibility. Projects began to be passed on to other people, without explanation. And he was always there, nearby, silently gaining ground. The cruelest thing was the calm tone he maintained. He was never openly aggressive. He never created direct conflict. He operated between the lines. And that made everything even harder to combat. Because to others, he was just a proactive and articulate colleague. But to me, he was the invisible saboteur of my trajectory. I thought about reporting it, about calling someone in leadership. But the culture of the environment held me back. There was a constant fear of being labeled as unstable, emotional, or even paranoid. In Silicon Valley, you learn quickly that taking a stand can come at a high cost. And unfortunately, the truth doesn't always win in the corporate world. Often, the one who can tell the best version of the story wins. And in that moment, he was winning. That's when I realized, if I wanted to get out of that situation with my integrity intact, I would need to do more than resist. I would need to grow beyond that environment. Show that my strength didn't come just from the position I held, but from my ability to reinvent myself, even when the world around me seemed to be working against me. Google had been a dream, but now I understood that it would also be the stage for one of the greatest lessons of my life. A lesson in what it truly means to be strong, and how sometimes the only way to win is to keep going, even when everything inside you wants to stay and fight. In the beginning, everything seems it was just a misunderstanding. Small frictions that, in a high-pressure environment like Google, could happen to anyone. But as the episodes accumulated, the feeling of being sabotaged stopped being a hypothesis and became an impossible-to-ignore fact. The environment was already tense, but at that moment I began to realize that the atmosphere around me had transformed into something more tense, more hostile, almost imperceptible to the eyes of those who were not paying attention, but absolutely suffocating for those who were directly affected. It felt like walking through a minefield. Any comment, any suggestion, any misinterpreted phrase could be used against me at some point in the future. And in the middle of this scenario, my colleague, the one who would later write me a desperate job application, acted with surgical precision, as if every move he made had been rehearsed to create confusion, to undermine my credibility without ever directly compromising himself. It was on a typical Tuesday afternoon that I realized I was playing a game I had never agreed to play, but which was already costing me dearly. We were in an interdepartmental meeting to discuss the direction of a new tool that had been in development for weeks. I had led much of the strategic design, and the expectation was that I would present the key implementation points to a table full of engineers, PMs, and 2 senior directors. But, without anything having been agreed upon, he started the meeting as if he were the host. He took the floor with an ease that seemed rehearsed. He went through the topics of the roadmap, as if he had participated in the conception of each item. He mentioned statistics that were in the reports I prepared, and with each sentence he uttered, I felt my presence in the room disappear. The most distressing thing was that he did all of this with elegance, with a tone of collaboration, as if he were simply complimenting what the team had produced. But to anyone who observed closely, it was clear. He had assumed my authorship. When I tried to intervene, my speech was interrupted by a sudden transition. He signaled a new topic on the agenda and moved on, leaving behind any possibility that I might change focus. I still tried to argue, to bring my ideas to the fore, but each time I spoke, I felt that my voice arrived late, as if it were an irrelevant echo in the middle of an already established discourse. And the cruelest thing was that the others in the room, even those who knew that I had led that project, remained silent. There was no reaction. There was no support. Just that uncomfortable feeling that no one wanted to get involved, that everyone had understood what was happening, but preferred to remain neutral. And that is precisely where the game becomes even more perverse. Because silence, in that environment, was the most strategic choice. Defending someone meant exposing yourself. And in that kind of culture, exposing yourself is putting your own career at risk. After that meeting, I began to observe everything more clearly. I began to notice patterns. the side conversations he had with other people on the team before meetings, the emails he sent minutes before meetings, highlighting strategic points that, until then, had only been discussed with me. The way he presented feedback on the performance of colleagues, always with ambiguous language, leaving room for negative interpretations without directly committing to any objective criticism. He was an expert at creating narratives, and in that environment, whoever dominated the narrative dominated the space. Google has always cultivated an image of a transparent company, but the truth is that there is an invisible layer of corporate politics that determines who rises and who is left behind. And my colleague played this game like a veteran. It was at that moment that I began to realize that I was losing the silent battle. As impeccable as my deliverables were, my presence was being erased. Not because of my mistakes, but because of a well-executed strategy by someone who knew how to manipulate perception in his favor. Each of his victories was built on a doubt planted in me, and little by little, I began to notice the effects of this on my routine. Relevant projects began to be redirected. Important meetings began to take place without my presence. And worst of all, my confidence began to fade. I woke up every day with a weight on my chest, as if I was always on the verge of failure. Even though I knew I was doing a good job, insecurity set in. I began to review each email dozens of times before sending it. I began to reread meeting records, trying to identify loopholes that would justify my absence. The pressure was not just external, it had already infiltrated me within. At this point, I began to isolate my energy in the essentials. I decided that if I was going to fall, I would fall on my feet. I redoubled my focus on deliverables. I began to document everything. At each meeting, I created written summaries. At each suggestion I made, I recorded them with dates and evidence. I began to build a silent network of allies, not in a political way, but in a genuine way. I sought out people who were suffering the same type of erasure and exchanged experiences. Little by little, I was rebuilding a sense of inner strength that did not depend on the validation of others. But even so, the structure of the environment had already been corrupted for me. And there came a time when I understood that, as much as I wanted to resist, staying there meant accepting a culture that rewarded appearances, not integrity. It was at this point that the idea of leaving began to become real. But before I left, there was something inside me that still wanted to resist. One last effort to try to turn the tide. I scheduled a direct conversation with my manager. I brought all the data, documents, delivery records, and messages that showed how my contributions had been appropriated by someone else. He listened, with a look somewhere between embarrassed and skeptical. He asked questions, praised my dedication, and at the end said that all of that would be carefully evaluated. But I knew, deep down, that that evaluation would never actually happen. The system had no room for that kind of conflict. Admitting that there was a problem would imply exposing a structural weakness that no one there wanted to acknowledge. I left that room with the certainty that there was no longer any possible path forward in that place, not for lack of competence, but because my presence was no longer welcome. The decision to leave was painful. There was still a part of me that wanted to succeed within that system, to show that it was possible to resist with dignity. But the price was too high. My mental health was compromised. My creativity was stifled. And above all, my peace had been exchanged for a constant state of alert. It was then that I decided to leave quietly, without making noise, without seeking confrontation, without making any public outbursts. I simply closed my laptop, met the deadlines, and when the last day came, I simply thanked those who truly supported me, even if discreetly, and left. I took with me an emotional baggage that would take months to process. But at that moment, the only certainty I had was that I needed to start over, and that somewhere in the future, the world would give me a chance to rewrite that story, a chance to rebuild everything, but now, on my own terms. When I left Google, I felt torn between two versions of myself. One part felt relieved to finally be away from an environment that had become unsustainable, while the other carried the weight of a bitter sense of defeat. Not for leaving the company, but for leaving in circumstances where injustice seemed to have won. As much as I had chosen to leave with dignity, it was impossible not to carry a silent pain of having been silenced, erased, defeated by a game I never wanted to play. But even in that moment of fragility, I knew one thing. I could not afford to stop. There was no time to wallow in resentment. I needed to rebuild myself. Because if there was one thing I had learned from that experience, it was that reputation, especially in Silicon Valley, is like an invisible currency that circulates behind the scenes. and I could not let the narrative that had been constructed about me be the last word in my trajectory. The first few months were difficult, not only because of the emotional impact, but because, in a way, I had lost my reference of value. When you work at a giant like Google, no matter how competent you are, it is impossible not to internalize that part of your credibility comes from the brand you carry. Suddenly, without the gold badge, without the institutional email that opened doors, you see yourself as a raw version of yourself. I had to relearn how to see myself without the external shine. I had to build a new professional narrative based on what I really knew, on what I could really deliver, and not just on the weight of the company that previously supported me. And this was perhaps the most difficult part of the process. Looking at myself honestly and understanding that the reconstruction would have to start from the inside out, not from the outside in. It was at that moment that I decided to go back to my roots. I reconnected with old contacts, people who knew my journey before I became ex-Google. I revived side projects that had been put aside by the corporate rush. I started writing about technology independently, sharing behind-the-scenes experiences that few had the courage to share, not as a form of revenge, but as a catharsis, and also as an attempt to transform pain into learning. And the most surprising thing was realizing that, outside the system, there was an entire world willing to listen. People who identified with what I had experienced, who had faced similar dynamics in other companies, who had also been erased, discredited, silenced. That gave me strength. It gave me the motivation to go beyond survival. I didn't just want to come out of that experience alive. I wanted to come out of it bigger. I began to study organizational culture management in depth. I immersed myself in case studies of companies that had managed to build truly healthy environments. I read everything I could about ethical leadership, people-centered innovation, and how to build high-performance teams without resorting to psychological terror. With each page, I felt something inside me reorganize itself. What had previously been a pile of frustrations began to take the form of a mission. And it was on this journey that the idea of becoming an entrepreneur began to emerge. Not as an impulsive act, but as a solid plan. To create a company that could be, for other people, what I did not have at that time. A space for real innovation, where people were valued not only for the results, but also for the way they achieved them. Where collaboration was a practice, and not just a pretty word on an About Us page. Of course, starting a business in Silicon Valley isn't something that happens overnight. Even more so when you're emotionally exhausted and need to recover your own social capital. But, interestingly enough, it was in this context that doors began to open. A former colleague, who had left the company a year before me, invited me for coffee. He said he had been following my publications, and that he was setting up a fund to invest in ideas led by women. Another contact, from an educational technology company, invited me to give a talk on product culture. And there, I met influential people who had left Google for similar reasons. Little by little, I started putting together loose pieces. Ideas that seemed distant began to gain structure. And before I knew it, I was faced with a real project. An MVP for a startup that combined technology and human development. A platform to accelerate innovative projects in medium-sized companies, with a focus on agile methodologies, organizational culture, and diversity. I put together a small team, people who, like me, had scars from the corporate world, but who still believed in the power of building something different. We started in a tiny room, with a tight budget and many doubts, but there was something there that could not be bought. Purpose. Each day of work was a step towards a model that we believed in. And despite all the difficulties, there was a feeling of belonging. No one needed to fight for territory. Ideas circulated freely. Decisions were shared. And above all, there was trust. A kind of trust that I had never experienced in a traditional corporate environment. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was in the right place. And this feeling was reflected in the growth of the company. In less than a year, we managed to attract our first corporate client. In 2 years, we already had a presence in 3 countries. And it was exactly then, when the company was starting to gain traction, that the message got through. It was a normal morning, between a planning meeting and an alignment meeting with the product team. I received a notification from LinkedIn. When I opened it, I saw his name. The same colleague who had systematically undermined my trajectory at Google. The same one who, with his ability to manipulate contexts, had erased me from meetings, taken my authorship, and forced me to leave on a path I did not choose. He sent me a message. The tone was cordial, almost intimate, as if we were resuming an old conversation. He said that he had followed my work, that he admired my resilience, and that he was looking for new opportunities. He explained in a few words that he had left Google some time ago and that his current journey was not aligned with his goals. And then came the final sentence, dry and direct. If there is an opening at your company, I would love to talk. At that moment, I felt no anger. I felt no desire for revenge. I felt a deep inner silence, as if life had turned a corner. He, who had once pulled the rug out from under me without hesitation, now extended his hand. Not out of explicit regret, but out of necessity. And I, who had once felt powerless in the face of injustice, was now in a position to decide his professional destiny. It was one of those rare moments in life when reality surpasses all fiction, a type of justice that does not need to be announced, that manifests itself by the simple fact that, despite everything, I was there, standing, grown, leader of something that I had built with my own hands. The only thing that came to mind, at that moment, was the certainty that I had won, not because I had overcome him, but because I had not become like him, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all. There is no manual that teaches you how to react when someone who has deeply harmed you in the past shows up years later, asking for help. Most people imagine that when they reach that moment, they would feel a kind of ecstasy, a kind of triumph, as if it were possible to rub in the other person's face everything they had caused, as if victory were validated by the other person's humiliation. But when that actually happens, the feeling is different. It is much more sober. There is a silence, an internal pause, a kind of respect for one's own path. When I read that message, from the former colleague who had sabotaged me, I felt no desire for revenge. There was no desire to laugh at the situation, no impulse to show power. What I felt was an almost clinical clarity, the certainty that I no longer needed to prove anything. Not to him, not to others, not even to myself. I had won the hardest game of all, the reputation game, and I had won without having to step on anyone to do it. It took me 2 days to respond to the message, not because I was insecure, but because I respected my own time. Because each word I chose at that moment would carry more than just content. It would carry a story. It would carry an emotional memory that could not be ignored. I reread everything he wrote. I analyzed between the lines, the way he used vague words like admiration and journey, the complete absence of any mention of the past, as if he could simply erase everything and start from scratch. And then I realized the most important thing. He was still playing. He still wanted to manipulate the narrative. But now, instead of trying to erase my image, he was trying to get closer to my light. It was subtle, but clear. He hadn't changed. He just changed tactics. And maybe he didn't even realize it. Maybe he really thought he was being sincere, which, at that point, didn't make much difference anymore. Because the decision to open a door, or not, doesn't depend solely on what the other person says, but on what you've learned to see over time. My response was objective, respectful, and, at the same time, unwavering. I thanked him for contacting me, wished him luck on his journey, and informed him that, at the moment, our team was full, and there were no open positions with his profile. I avoided any judgment. I didn't mention the past. I didn't bring up resentment, but I also didn't offer any openness. Because offering openness in that case would be denying everything I had learned. It would be allowing the cycle to repeat itself. And I had built my company precisely to break this type of pattern. To create an environment where vanity and sabotage had no place. Where the culture was not shaped by fear or convenience, but by real principles. That's why responding with polite coolness was more than necessary. It was consistent with who I had become. Because dignity, at the end of the day, is also knowing how to say no. Knowing how to recognize that not every apology needs to be verbal to be answered with a clear limit. After this exchange, I began to reflect on what that meant. Not only to me, but to so many other people who are living similar stories. In the world of big tech, the narrative of success is often distorted. The media talks about innovation, billions in valuation, collaborative culture, cool offices. But few people talk about the psychological exhaustion, the silent internal politics, the emotional cost of staying in environments that, although they shine on the outside, corrode on the inside. And the strangest thing is that, even with all this, thousands of professionals continue to aspire to these places, as if they were the pinnacle of professional fulfillment. I myself once believed this. I once thought that working at Google was the ultimate goal. But today, looking back, I realized that it was just a stage. An important part of the journey, yes, but not the destination. Because true success is not in the position you hold or the company that hires you. It is in the freedom to be who you are, wherever you are. In Silicon Valley, reputation is currency. It's what defines who gets called into the rooms that matter, who gets nominated for new projects, who gets the chance to scale ideas with real impact. But this currency isn't built with titles, it's built with stories. And stories are built with choices. Every time you choose to act with integrity, even when no one is watching. Every time you decide not to retaliate with the same violence that hit you. Every time you choose to build something real instead of just taking up space. These decisions shape the perception people have of you. And more importantly, they shape the perception you have of yourself. Because in the end, what matters most is not what others say. It's what you can sustain when you're alone in front of the mirror, away from the applause and the likes. For a long time, I believed that I needed the approval of others to validate my path. I needed recognition, awards, mentions, metrics that proved that I was good enough. But today, I understand that the most powerful validation comes from inner silence. From the peace of knowing that you built something solid without giving up your principles. From the tranquility of moving forward without carrying the weight of regret. And that was exactly what I felt when I responded to that email. A lightness that did not come from revenge, but from coherence. The feeling that, even unintentionally, he gave me the opportunity to close a cycle. A cycle that began with pain, but ended with maturity. And perhaps that is the true justice that life offers. Not the justice of punishment, but the justice of a clear conscience. Of course, this episode became symbolic. It made me look more closely at everything I had built. The company that was born from chaos. The team that was formed around a culture based on trust. The clients who sought us out precisely because of what made us different. Authenticity. And more than that, it made me understand that there are times when life tests us not by what we are capable of doing, but by what we are capable of refusing. I could have hired that former colleague. I could have shown power, superiority. I could have turned it into a marketing piece, a case of overcoming. But I chose not to do any of that. Because I didn't need to. And when you no longer need to prove anything, that's when you understand that you've won. Because true power lies in not having to use it to feel whole. This experience also made me think about the role of leadership. For a long time, I associated leadership with charisma, the ability to influence, to engage teams, to inspire. But today, I believe that true leadership is the kind that manifests itself in difficult decisions. In the way you deal with those who have hurt you. In the way you protect the culture you are building. In the courage to maintain your boundaries, even when it is not popular. Leadership is also about protecting the space of others. It is about ensuring that the environment you build is safe not only for yourself, but for everyone who trusts you. And that requires constant vigilance. Because just as he appeared in my inbox, other people with similar behaviors will appear. And it is up to me, and anyone in decision-making positions, to choose who to walk with. Because in the end, no matter how brilliant someone is technically, if they lack character, they will compromise everything that is being built. This is the part that few people talk about when it comes to success. It's not just about achieving something. It's about sustaining what you've achieved with integrity. And that's not always easy, because the market will test your values. Opportunities will test your ethics. And at some point, life will put before you exactly what once tried to destroy you, just to see if you still carry the same wounds or if you've already healed. The answer you give at that moment is what truly defines your trajectory. And my answer was clear, silent, and definitive. I no longer need what I have. I no longer need to be accepted where I was once erased, because now I have built my own place. And whoever enters that place enters not because of the past they carry, but because of the vision of the future they are able to sustain. Time has a curious way of organizing events. At first, everything seems disconnected, almost meaningless, like scattered pieces of a puzzle that don't fit together. But with enough distance, the features begin to reveal themselves, and suddenly what seemed unfair becomes a learning experience. What seemed like a failure becomes a foundation. And what seemed like a fall actually turns out to be the necessary push for a new kind of ascension. That's exactly what happened to me. When I left Google, I had no idea that, years later, I would be reflecting on all that, not with regret, but with lucidity. And much less that I would have the opportunity to reconstruct my story on my own terms. But what surprised me the most was realizing how, over time, even the most difficult moments take on new meaning when you change the way you position yourself in the face of them. After that episode with my former colleague, a lot changed within me. not only emotionally but also in the way I viewed my journey. For the first time, I looked at everything I had experienced with a sense of stability. No longer as a survivor of the toxic culture of a big tech company, but as someone who had gone through that experience and emerged from it with discernment. This gave me the strength to start sharing my story more openly. I was invited to participate in a panel on ethics and organizational culture at a technology conference. It was one of those big conferences where executives, investors, founders, and leaders from various companies are present. When they invited me, I thought about turning it down. I was still afraid, a feeling that telling this story in public could expose me too much. But then I realized that the time had come, because that story was no longer just about me. It was about something much bigger. On the day of the event, I went up on stage with my heart racing. But as I spoke, I realized that the audience wasn't just listening, they were recognizing themselves. Each story I told generated absolute silence in the audience, a type of listening that doesn't happen out of politeness, but out of identification. I spoke about the high-performance culture that degenerates into veiled rivalry. I spoke about how metrics have become the new name for fear. I spoke about how innovation often hides dynamics of exclusion. But I also spoke about reconstruction, about how it's possible to create environments that truly value talent without nullifying humanity. And at the end, when I got off the stage, I received dozens of messages, looks, and hugs from people who had experienced the same thing, to a greater or lesser extent. There, I realized that the silence I had experienced in the past had been replaced by collective listening, and that somehow, my pain had become a bridge. This movement changed my company. It changed my positioning. I started investing more in internal mentoring programs, opening up space for regular listening sessions within the team, and reviewing processes to ensure that not only the results, but also the means were consistent with our principles. I created an area dedicated exclusively to culture and well-being, led by someone who, like me, had already faced destructive environments and knew from personal experience what was necessary to prevent this from happening again. We started documenting cases, mapping leadership patterns, and developing indicators not only for performance, but also for emotional safety. And this didn't happen because it was fashionable, but because it was urgent. Because if we really want to change the work scenario in technology companies, we need to start from the inside. It's not enough to talk about diversity, innovation, and culture. We need to live these values every day, even when it's most difficult. In the following months, I was approached by other leaders. Some wanted to understand how we managed to scale with such a solid culture. Others wanted support to redesign their own companies. We began offering strategic consulting, and soon we were serving corporations that were much larger than we had imagined. In all of them, the pattern was repeated. Lots of technological sophistication, but little emotional structure. Fine-tuned processes, but fragile relationships. High performance, but low mental health. And that was precisely where I found my purpose. I understood that what happened to me was not an exception. It was a symptom. And that there were thousands of brilliant professionals being undermined by cultures that normalized abuse, that rewarded ego, that placed goals above people. My role now was not just to create a profitable company, it was to create a reference, to show that it is possible to win without giving in to dirty play, that it is possible to scale ethically, that it is possible to transform the model without losing its power. It wasn't easy. Many people resisted. There were those who said that this type of speech was too idealistic, that companies need results, not philosophies, that the market doesn't tolerate sentimentality. But every time I heard this type of argument, I remembered my journey. I remembered the pain I felt when I was silenced. I remembered the way I almost lost faith in myself. And I used that as fuel. Because if someone had told me, years ago, that one day I would be in charge of an organization admired precisely for its culture, I would have doubted. But now, living in this scenario, I didn't just believe it. I knew it was possible. Because I had lived the opposite. And surviving the opposite gives a clarity that no book teaches. I began to document this journey more intensely. I wrote articles, gave interviews, recorded videos, and participated in podcasts. I spoke to young people who were just entering this market. I spoke to executives who were tired of being part of cultures that no longer believed in them. I spoke to women who, like me, had been diminished and were now looking for spaces to start over. In each conversation, a new layer of my story was revealed. I realized that telling this journey was not just an exercise in memory. It was a gesture of reparation. Because each time a story is told, it gains new meaning. And the strongest meaning this story could have was to inspire others to do things differently, to not accept environments that hurt them, to not remain silent when they are disrespected, to understand that the value of a career is not in the badge you wear, but in the dignity with which you walk, even when no one is looking. This journey also taught me about forgiveness, not the forgiveness that is offered to others as a way of absolving them, but the internal forgiveness. The forgiveness of accepting that you were a victim, yes, but that you don't need to define yourself by that. The forgiveness that makes room for you to move on, that frees you from the burden of wanting answers, of waiting for regrets that may never come, that allows you to look back without feeling trapped in that place. I forgave my colleague, not because he apologized, but because I chose to no longer carry what he did to me. I chose to no longer feed that chapter. I chose to write others, with other people, in other contexts. And above all, I chose to believe that it was possible to create environments where no one needed to be silenced so that someone else could be promoted. This is the reflection that remains with me, that true success is not a finish line. It is a daily choice. It is the choice to do things differently, to be better than what hurt you, to build spaces where other people can grow without fear, to leave a legacy that goes beyond results. Because in the end, companies pass, roles change, platforms evolve, but what remains is how you made people feel. And if, one day, someone remembers my leadership as a place where they felt safe, respected, inspired, then I will know that it was all worth it. Because there is no greater victory than being remembered for having done what was right, even when it would have been easier to choose the path of revenge. And that, for me, will always be the measure of a life well lived. Starting from scratch in Silicon Valley is not like starting anywhere else. Here, every step is monitored, every decision is discussed behind the scenes, and every mistake spreads as quickly as a notification. This ecosystem sells the world an image of innovation, creative freedom, and companies that start in garages and become empires in a few years. But behind this dream narrative, there is a much harsher reality, a market that is competitive to the core, where networking is often worth more than talent, where what people say about you carries more weight than what you actually deliver, and where failure is romanticized in speeches but punished behind the scenes. It was in this context that I had to relearn how to exist. After leaving Google, with an invisible scar on my back, I had to redesign every part of my career. There were no shortcuts, there were no guarantees. There was only work, silence, and the desire to prove, to myself, that my career would not be defined by a chapter of sabotage, but by my ability to rewrite history. At first, the feeling was ambiguous. On the one hand, there was the freedom of being outside a system that had made me sick, of being able to think clearly, of no longer living under the constant tension of being erased. On the other, there was emptiness, the absence of structure, of belonging, of direction. For years, I had walked a clear path, excellent academic training, competitive positions, prestigious companies, but now I was in the dark. I had solid technical background, yes. I had a reputation that had not yet been completely destroyed, but I also carried the insecurity of someone who had been hurt inside, who had experienced the worst side of an environment where everything seemed perfect on the outside. And rebuilding self-confidence in these cases is a slow process. It doesn't happen with a course. It can't be solved with a new degree. It is something that needs to be rebuilt silently, every day, through small choices. I started small. I accepted occasional consulting jobs, often for companies that didn't have even half the structure of Google. But each of these projects helped me recover something. The feeling of being useful, the pleasure in solving problems, the genuine connection with people who valued my knowledge without political games. In these interactions, I realized something important. My value was intact. What had been corrupted was not my competence. It was the way it had been perceived within a contaminated environment. And this gave me the strength to go further. I began to design a platform that would help companies identify, measure, and transform their internal cultures. I wanted to create a tool that would serve as an emotional and strategic thermometer at the same time. That would show where the noise was, the human bottlenecks, the spaces where talent was being wasted, not due to lack of capacity, but due to poor emotional management. I put together a prototype with the few resources I had. I presented the idea to a few incubators and heard a lot of no's. They said that the culture market was difficult to scale, that there was no clear problem being solved, that companies talked a lot about culture but invested little in it. And in part, they were right. But I knew the problem inside out. I knew it was real. and that sooner or later, companies would be forced to deal with it, not just for ethical reasons, but for sheer survival. Toxic environments generate turnover, and turnover is expensive. Toxic environments kill innovation, and without innovation, no company stays at the top for long. I kept insisting. I refined the pitch. I tested other angles, and in one of these attempts, an angel investor, who had been through a traumatic layoff at a big tech company, showed interest. We scheduled a meeting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being listened to by someone who understood the pain from direct experience, not from theory. With this initial investment, I was able to put together a lean team. I brought together people I had known for years, with whom I had worked before, and who shared the same vision, that it was possible to build high-performance environments without sacrificing people's mental health. We developed the first version of the platform in 4 months. We began testing with small companies, early-stage startups, and groups of entrepreneurs. The feedback was immediate. Managers were surprised by the data that emerged. They discovered that the main points of friction were where they had never looked before: in poorly prepared leaders, in truncated communications, in evaluation processes that, instead of motivating, created fear. Within a few weeks, we already had waiting lists for testing. Within 3 months, the platform was mentioned in an innovation newsletter in the Valley, and then the emails started arriving. Mid-sized companies, accelerators, and even some multinationals curious about the model. But more than the contracts, what impressed me was the nature of the conversations. For the first time, I saw top executives admitting that they didn't know how to deal with the invisible pain that was spreading within their teams. I saw startup founders recognizing that they were repeating toxic patterns without realizing it. I saw leaders asking for help, not because they were in an image crisis, but because they were in an internal crisis. And that's when I realized the impact of what we were building. It wasn't a compliance solution. It was a proposal for real transformation, something that went beyond branding, beyond stage speeches. We were putting culture at the center of the strategy, and that was generating movement, a real movement. In this process, the company grew. We hired more people. We expanded to other countries. We received a second round of funding. But the most valuable thing was not the financial growth. It was the type of people that our culture began to attract. Professionals who had already been hurt by aggressive environments, but who had not lost faith. People with talent and heart, with courage and humility. People who were not just looking for a good salary or a prestigious position, but for a place where they could make sense. And this transformed our team into something that went beyond a team. We became a community, a support network, a space where the pains of the past were not hidden, but shared and, little by little, healed. Where each victory was celebrated as collective reparation, where each piece of feedback was a joint construction, an environment where no one needed to be perfect, but everyone needed to be true. And perhaps this was the greatest gift of this entire journey, understanding that starting over, when done consciously, can be more powerful than any linear continuity, because it carries intention. It carries depth. It carries scars that are no longer wounds, but maps. And it was with these maps that we guided each decision, from the way we recruited to the way we closed projects. Everything was permeated by a fundamental question: is this consistent with what we want to build? And this question, as simple as it may seem, was what kept us whole. Because in the corporate world, especially in technology, it is very easy to get lost. It is very easy to give in to immediacy, to vanity indicators, to the pressure of growth at any cost. But we knew, from our own experience, the price of playing this game, and we chose not to pay it. Today, looking back, I can clearly see that each fall was a step forward, that each silence that suffocated me in the past prepared me to listen better today, that each betrayal taught me to better select my alliances, that each environment where I was not recognized trained me to recognize others with more sensitivity, and that each attempt to erase myself taught me to build my own light, a light that does not need a spotlight, that does not depend on approval, that simply exists, and that lights the way not only for me, but for those who walk alongside me. Because in the end, starting over in Silicon Valley was not about proving anything to anyone. It was about remembering who I was before the system tried to convince me otherwise. And this reunion, as painful as it was also the most liberating of all. When your reputation starts to return, you feel it before you hear it. It's a subtle movement, almost imperceptible at first glance. An unexpected message from someone you haven't spoken to in years. an invitation to participate in a roundtable, a brand mentioning you in a publication as a reference for conscious leadership. Your name starts to circulate, no longer under suspicion or silence, but with respect. What was once tarnished now begins to shine again, but not with that manufactured shine that the corporate world loves so much. It's a different kind of light, one that comes from resistance, from coherence, from patient construction. That's exactly how I realized the game was changing. No forced marketing, no self-promotion campaigns. Just doing the right job, in the right way, with the right people. Because when you choose integrity as your path, it may even come slowly, but it arrives. And when it arrives with depth, with weight, with truth. In the beginning, there was still some distrust. After all, Silicon Valley is driven by hype cycles. Startups come and go in a matter of months. Founders become phenomena one quarter and disappear the next. And I knew that, to be taken seriously again, it wasn't enough to have a good story. I needed consistency, concrete deliverables, results that not only impressed investors, but also transformed the reality of the companies we served. That's why I decided to adopt a silent, almost artisanal approach. I didn't want to rush to scale. I wanted to strengthen the base. Each client we served was treated as if they were the only one. Each case was studied in depth. Each improvement in the platform came from real insights, not from rushing to launch something that seemed new. And this decision, which many considered conservative, was what saved us. Because while others burned themselves trying to grow too fast, we grew in a solid, sustainable, and, above all, respectful way. It was in this scenario that invitations to more strategic events began to arrive, no longer as a generic panelist, but as a keynote speaker, as someone who was proposing a new way of thinking about organizational culture within technology. I presented our cases at conferences in the area of people analytics, and was invited to speak to boards of global companies about how to prevent toxic environments before they explode. All of this happened naturally, without having to ask for space, because the space came to us. And this taught me something fundamental about reputation. It is not a short-term construction. It is the accumulation of small choices made coherently over time. And especially in the world of big tech, where everything is so performative, authenticity becomes a differentiator. While everyone tries to appear innovative, those who really are start to stand out without having to shout. The return of recognition did not come only from the market. It also came from people. Former colleagues began to contact me. Some just to say that they had been following my work. Others to confess that they had witnessed my past sabotage and did not know how to act. And some, like the former colleague who wrote to me asking for a job, looking for a second chance. Each of these messages was like a page turning, not because I needed anyone's validation, but because they were reminders that nothing stays hidden forever, that sooner or later, the truth finds its way, even if silently, even if through crooked lines. And this realization changed everything, because for the first time in a long time, I felt that I was no longer fighting against something. I was simply walking in favor of what I believed in. And this movement, as simple as it may seem, is a turning point. It was at that moment that I understood that the game in Silicon Valley was not about speed. It was about depth, about who, despite the pressures, could keep a steady hand, about who, faced with ethical conflicts, chose the hardest path, the path of character. Because time here is brutal, it accelerates and destroys with equal intensity. But it also rewards those who resist with determination. And that was what I began to see. Reputation is not what they say about you at the top. It is what continues to be said when the spotlight fades, when the wave of euphoria passes, when investors change focus, when the next big tech trend pushes your product out of the headlines. What remains there, in the shadows, is what really matters. And in that place, I had built something strong. A name that now was associated not only with competence, but with courage, lucidity, consistency. And that, to me, was more valuable than any title. But getting your reputation back isn't just about you. It's also about what you do with it. Because when your name starts to carry weight again, you start to influence decisions, to shape thoughts, to open or close doors for other people. And that requires responsibility. I started to be sought out to recommend professionals, to participate in culture committees, to co-design leadership programs. In each of these situations, I remembered everything I had experienced. The rooms where I had been ignored, the meetings where my voice was silenced, the spaces where I had been denied the right to be heard, and I used that memory as a guide, so that no one else would have to go through that. To ensure that every space I helped to build or influence was fairer, more humane, safer. Because now I was no longer trying to be accepted. I was creating the spaces themselves. This new phase also allowed me to find my voice again. The voice that had been silenced for so long by the fear of appearing weak, emotional, resentful. Now I could speak clearly. I could name things for what they were, without hatred, without revenge, but with precision. I started writing more frequently. Articles, essays, even drafts of a book. I began to systematize everything I had learned about culture, leadership, ethics, and high-performance environments. And the more I wrote, the more I realized that this was not just a settling of accounts with the past. It was an invitation to the future. A future where companies understand that results and humanity are not opposing forces, where performance does not need to be built on fear, where status does not depend on the nullification of others. And this vision began to spread, first within my own company, then among clients, then in the broader ecosystem, and, almost inevitably, behind the scenes of big tech. Some of them started to come to us, asking for help to redesign their internal structures, to understand why, even with all the resources, they still faced alarming levels of burnout, turnover, and creative stagnation. And there I was, the woman who, years ago, had been excluded from those same environments, now being called in to help fix them. The irony of this never ceased to amaze me, but it also never poisoned me, because I knew what I had done to get there. I knew the price, I knew the path, and that gave me a kind of peace of mind that no one could take away. Because I wasn't there by luck or by marketing. I was there by true merit. A merit that isn't measured in awards, but in consistency. In doing what's right even when no one is looking. In keeping your essence intact even when under attack. And above all, in continuing even when everything inside you wanted to stop. Seeing my reputation return, therefore, was more than a reparation. It was a kind of rebirth. Not of the same version of me that one day entered Google full of dreams and naivety, but of a new woman. Stronger, more lucid, more whole. A leader who knew exactly what she wanted to build and what she would no longer accept. Who understood the value of her own name, not as a bargaining chip, but as a symbol of integrity. And who, above all, no longer needed to ask permission to exist. Because she had learned that, when you build your truth firmly, the world may even try to bring you down. But sooner or later, it will have to recognize you remained. And that, in the end, is what defines the names that remain. Not those who shouted the loudest, but those who sustained their silence until it became an echo.